September 6, 1976, Chuguyevka Air Base, Soviet Far East, 120 miles from Vladivostok, close enough to smell the Pacific. A flight surgeon looks at a blood pressure reading and frowns. The number is high. He asks the pilot if everything is all right. The pilot says yes, he's been exercising. The surgeon believes him because this man is trusted, completely, absolutely trusted. Party secretary of his squadron, flawless service record, not a single reprimand in 5 years of service. If you built a Soviet pilot from scratch in a laboratory, you'd get Viktor Ivanovich Belenko. The surgeon waves him through. Belenko walks to the kindergarten first. He drops off his 3-year-old son, Dmitry. He doesn't linger. He walks to the flight line. He climbs into the cockpit of the Mikoyan Gurevich MiG-25, the most secret, most feared combat aircraft on the planet. Inside his jacket, the aircraft's classified pilot's manual, strictly forbidden to remove from the base. He is never coming back. And if you want to find out what happens next, and trust me, you do, hit subscribe, because this is the kind of story that only gets told once. The MiG-25 wasn't just an aircraft, it was a psychological operation with wings. And in July 1967, the Soviet Union flew it directly over the Pentagon's worst nightmares. In July 1967, the Soviet Union unveiled the Foxbat, NATO's code name, at an air show outside Moscow. 3 prototypes screamed overhead. The photographs sent shockwaves through the Pentagon. Massive intakes, twin tails, engine exhausts nearly 60 inches wide. Intelligence analysts looked at those photographs and concluded the Soviets had built something that should not be possible. A fighter that could fly at Mach 3.2, climb to 89,000 feet, outrun anything in the Western arsenal. The Americans didn't wait to find out if it was real. They started building the F-15 Eagle specifically to kill it. They developed an entirely new missile program, the AIM-97 Seekbat Mach 3.5 rockets with a 90-mile range, purely to counter a plane they had never touched, never tested, never sat inside. Billions of dollars, years of engineering, all of it aimed at a ghost. The Soviets, to their credit, had done exactly what they intended. Meanwhile, the man they trusted with this ghost was having a very bad year. Viktor Belenko was born in Nalchik, a mid-sized city in the Russian Republic of Kabardino-Balkaria. His father worked in a factory. There was no money, no connections, no safety net. The military fed you and clothed you and gave you purpose. So that's where Belenko went. He was exceptional from the start. Languages came easily, mathematics came easily, flying came more easily than either. By 1972, he was pushing for a transfer to MiG-25 training. Not assigned, requesting. He wanted the hardest posting, the most advanced aircraft, the top of the food chain. His commander made an exception for him. Belenko was that good. But the posting he received was Chuguyevka. And Chuguyevka was, to put it diplomatically, not what was advertised. Roads unpaved, buildings crumbling, facilities that would embarrass a third-tier base. When Belenko raised concerns with his superiors, the political officer laughed him off. The system that had made him exceptional had no interest in his opinions. His wife, Lyudmila, from a wealthy Moscow family, a woman who had not signed up for permafrost and broken plumbing, told him that summer she was filing for divorce in October and taking Dmitry to her parents in Magadan. Belenko later said he hated her. He said he knew the child would be fine with her family's connections. He said a lot of things. Whether he believed them is another matter. What he did next was not impulsive. When KGB investigators searched his flat after the defection, they found a personal diary. In it, fuel calculations, precise, methodical, worked out over months. They also discovered he had been in Moscow just 1 week before the flight. The Soviets immediately concluded it was a CIA operation. that Belenko had met a handler in the capital and received his final instructions. It wasn't. There was no handler. There was one man with a notebook, a grievance, and enough mathematical ability to calculate his way out of the Soviet Union. The plan was elegant in its constraints. The MiG-25 consumed fuel at a rate that bordered on self-parody. A fully loaded Foxbat weighed 64,000 pounds, and most of that weight was jet fuel. Flying low at the speeds required to stay under Soviet coastal radar, burned through that fuel even faster. Belenko ran the numbers repeatedly. The United States was out of range. Canada was out of range. Japan, maybe, barely. On a day with a full tank, clear weather, and nothing going wrong. He chose September 6th because the forecast looked clean. He would fly at 100 feet above the Sea of Japan, low enough that his radar signature would disappear from Soviet screens, low enough that he'd have to dodge fishing boats in the morning mist. He had memorized the maps because taking them was prohibited, and his target was Chaitos Air Base near Sapporo in central Hokkaido, a military field, a long enough runway. He expected to be intercepted by Japanese fighters and escorted in. He had the manual ready to hand over in person. What he had not planned for was the weather closing over Japan. One more detail about that morning that I find remarkable, and I think you will too. The squadron was carrying live rockets that day. Other MiG-23s from nearby bases were also in the air. Any of them could have shot him down. He knew this. He climbed into the cockpit anyway. He said later, when a journalist found him at an air show in Reno, sitting behind a table of books, asking people if they wanted an autograph, he said, "Why not? One way or another, it was my lucky day." At the far edge of the training route, when his wingmates banked left to return to base, Belenko kept going. He pushed the Foxbat into a steep dive, 100 feet above the Sea of Japan. The waves were close enough to see individual whitecaps. He had to maneuver around fishing boats materializing out of the morning haze. Behind him, his squadron assumed he had augured in, that the plane had simply gone down. No one raised an alarm immediately. That was part of the math. He crossed into Japanese airspace and pulled up to 20,000 feet, deliberately so he'd show up on Japanese radar and not get shot down as an unidentified intruder. At 1:10 p.m., Japanese ground radar picked him up. At 1:20, two F-4EJ Phantoms scrambled from Chaitos, the very base he'd planned to land at. His radio was set to Soviet military frequencies. Japanese air traffic control couldn't reach him. The Phantoms had poor look-down radar capability and lost him in the cloud cover. He was alone now, in enemy airspace, on memorized maps, the fuel gauge falling. He couldn't find Chaitos. The clouds were thickening, and then, through a break in the overcast, a runway appeared below him. Not Chaitos, Hakodate, a civilian airport, a 9,843-foot runway, shorter than anything the Foxbat was supposed to land on. As he lined up his approach, a Boeing 727 appeared directly in front of him on its takeoff roll. Passengers, crew, ordinary people going somewhere, completely unaware that the world's most secret fighter was about to use the same piece of tarmac. Belenko jerked the MiG into the tightest turn it could physically execute, let the 727 clear, then dove at a dangerously steep angle and touched down at 220 knots, nearly double the normal approach speed for that runway. He deployed the drogue parachute. He hammered the brakes hard enough to blow the nose tire. The Foxbat bucked, shuddered, screamed down the runway, and ran 800 feet past the end, knocking down two poles before stopping just short of a large antenna. He shut the engines down. The gauges read 0, 30 seconds of fuel remaining. He climbed out onto the wing, drew his service pistol, fired into the air. Workers and civilians began running toward him from the terminal, some already raising cameras. Viktor Belenko, the most trusted pilot in the Soviet air defense forces, had just committed the single most damaging act of espionage in Cold War aviation history, and he'd done it in a plane that nearly killed a commercial airliner on the way in. What followed was three-way diplomatic chaos of a kind that doesn't happen very often. Japan was caught between two superpowers pulling in opposite directions. The Soviets wanted the aircraft and the pilot returned immediately. The Americans wanted inside that cockpit more than they'd wanted almost anything since the war ended. Japan characteristically wanted to make everyone happy and anger no one, which, in this situation, was geometrically impossible. A young American diplomat named Nicholas Platt was pulled off a tennis court on Labor Day to manage the situation. He and his Japanese counterparts devised a solution. The landing gear had been damaged, they told the Soviets. The aircraft needed to be transferred to Hyakuri Air Base for dismantling and safe shipping. What they didn't mention was that Hyakuri happened to be jointly operated with the U.S. Air Force. The Soviets accepted this explanation. For approximately 60 days, American and Japanese engineers took the MiG-25 apart piece by piece, and what they found dismantled a decade of Western fear faster than any weapons program ever could. The airframe was not titanium, it was stainless steel, heavy, industrial, welded by hand. The construction was so rough that Western engineers could see exposed rivet heads and hand-weld marks. The performance numbers the Soviets had been broadcasting for years were physically impossible with this airframe. Its real top speed was Mach 2.83. Exceed that, and the engines destroyed themselves. One Israeli-tracked MiG-25 that had pushed past Mach 3 had to scrap both engines afterward. Its real service ceiling was 79,000 feet, not 89,000, and only sustainable for 2 minutes without a full missile load. Then they found the vacuum tubes. Western fighters had been using transistors for years, solid-state electronics, miniaturized circuitry. The most feared aircraft in the world was running avionics technology from the 1950s. And here's the thing that the initial shock obscured. There was a reason. Those vacuum tubes were radiation hardened. The Foxbat wasn't designed to win a dogfight. It was designed to survive a nuclear exchange and still get airborne. The Soviets were building for a different war than the one everyone assumed was coming. The radar, designated the RP-25 Smerch-A, codenamed Foxfire by NATO, weighed over half a ton. It was so powerful that, according to a pilot who flew the aircraft, it would kill a rabbit at 300 yards if the animal wandered onto the taxiway while the plane was moving. That is genuinely a feature they documented. But Foxfire had a fatal flaw. It was completely blind below 500 meters. It could not look down. It could not shoot down. It had been designed exclusively to intercept high-altitude bombers on a straight-line approach, a threat that had been strategically obsolete for years before Belenko ever defected. CIA Director George Herbert Walker Bush, yes, that one, the future president, called it an intelligence bonanza. The AIM-97 Seekbat missile program, years in development, billions committed, was canceled within months. The entire premise it had been built on had just been proven wrong. Meanwhile, the Soviets were not taking any of this graciously. They claimed Belenko had been drugged by the Japanese. They seized at least 8 Japanese fishing vessels operating in the Sea of Okhotsk and imprisoned their crews, men who had nothing to do with any of this, fishermen who went out one morning and came back to find themselves pawns in a Cold War standoff as apparent retaliation for Japan's delay in returning the aircraft. Japan sent the Soviet Union a bill for $40,000 covering runway damage and shipping costs. The Soviets counterbilled Japan $10 million for damage to the aircraft, citing 20 missing parts when it was returned. Neither bill was ever paid. The MiG left Japan in 30 crates aboard the Soviet cargo ship Tygonos, arriving in Vladivostok on November 18, 1976. It was reassembled. It was never flown again. It spent the remainder of its existence as a training aid at an aviation academy in Daugavpils, Latvia, a visual aid for students learning about a plane that had already been rendered obsolete by the man who flew it to Japan. One final footnote on the intelligence bonanza, and I genuinely cannot decide if this is funny or just quintessentially Cold War. Engineers from Hasegawa, a Japanese-scale model company, were reportedly allowed access during the disassembly. They went from zero knowledge to a complete commercial model kit in 100 days. The world's most classified aircraft became something you could buy at a hobby shop before the year was out. Viktor Belenko got almost everything he asked for. He was debriefed by the CIA and the Air Force for 5 months. President Gerald Ford granted him asylum. In 1980, the United States Congress passed Private Law 96-62, a specific act of legislation signed by Jimmy Carter granting citizenship to one specific person. It happened for Belenko. He worked as a consultant at defense contractors. A former colleague at Northrop, who had security clearance and knew Belenko personally throughout the 1980s, described him as humble, grateful, and genuinely curious about American life. He designed and built a home in Montana with his American wife, a music teacher from North Dakota. He made beef stroganoff for guests. He changed his surname to Schmidt. He moved constantly through small towns across the Midwest. He almost never gave interviews, and according to people who knew him, he feared for his life every single day until the day he died. The KGB's reputation for reaching defectors on foreign soil was not theoretical. Belenko knew exactly what his former employer was capable of. He had read the files. Back in the Soviet Union, the propaganda machine worked on a rotating schedule. He was killed in a car accident. He was arrested. He was executed. He had come back voluntarily. None of it was true, but all of it was broadcast. And then there is the matter of Dmitry. Before his defection, Belenko sent word back through channels, the exact nature of which has never been fully documented, telling his 3-year-old son that the Soviet reports about having a father who defected were propaganda, that his father didn't exist in the way they were describing. In 1980, he published a book confirming that Dmitry was real, that the marriage had existed, that he had left. Whether Dmitry ever read that book is not recorded. Whether they spoke after the Soviet collapse, when it might have been possible, is not documented anywhere. He expressed grief to people who knew him about leaving his mother, not his wife, not his son, his mother. Make of that what you will. There is one consequence of Belenko's defection that almost no documentary about him has ever addressed. It requires a 7-year jump forward. After the defection, Soviet High Command made a policy decision. They would never trust their own pilots with a full fuel load again. Interceptors on Sakhalin bases, the large Soviet island sitting just north of Japan's Hokkaido, would be filled with just enough fuel to complete their assigned mission. Not enough to defect. The logic was simple. The implication, apparently, did not concern anyone in Moscow. September 1st, 1983, Korean Airlines Flight 007, a civilian Boeing 747 carrying 269 people, passengers, including a United States Congressman, Lawrence McDonald of Georgia, drifted off course and entered Soviet airspace over Sakhalin Island. Soviet interceptors scrambled. The first pursuit aircraft, designated Kosmin 240, caught up with the 747, then hit fuel limits and had to break off the chase. The fuel restrictions imposed directly because of Viktor Belenko meant the interceptors couldn't properly shadow the aircraft, couldn't execute a controlled identification procedure, couldn't do anything but hand the intercept off in a rushed, chaotic chain of command that ended with the Soviet Su-15 launching 2 missiles at a civilian airliner at 1826 UTC. 269 people, all of them gone. Belenko didn't cause Cal 007. Let me be clear about that. The Soviets pulled the trigger. Soviet commanders gave the order. Soviet political paranoia created the conditions. But the documented chain runs from his cockpit in September 1976 to that night over Sakhalin in September 1983. One defection, 7 years, 269 dead. History rarely moves in straight lines, but sometimes it does. In 1995, during the Yeltsin presidency, the brief window when such a thing was remotely possible without ending badly, Belenko returned to Moscow on a business trip. He came back to the United States without incident. He did not document publicly whether he looked for Dmitry. He went fishing with Chuck Yeager. He moved to a small town in Illinois. In 2000, a journalist found him at the Reno air races, sitting behind a table of books, completely unguarded. "Hi," he said, "you want autograph?" He told the journalist he was happy in America. He said Americans had a tolerance for different opinions that he had never found anywhere else. He said, some people want to hug trees and some people want to cut them down, and they live side by side. He almost never appeared in public again. Viktor Belenko died on September 24, 2023, in a nursing home in Redbud, Illinois. He was 76 years old. His family did not announce his death for 2 months, and his son told the New York Times that his father died after a brief illness, with his 2 American sons beside him. He is survived by those 2 sons, 4 grandchildren, and a son in Russia, now in his early 50s, whose relationship with his father's memory belongs entirely to him. Belenko's knee-pad notebook from the flight sits behind glass at the CIA Museum in Langley, Virginia. His Soviet military identity document is displayed beside it. The F-15 Eagle, built to fight it, is still in service. The Hasegawa model kit is still available online if you're curious. Not ideology, not money. He defected because the system that made him exceptional had decided his future was already written. He grieved his mother. He was silent about his son. He feared for his life for 47 years. A factory worker's son from Nalchik, a notebook, a stolen manual, 30 seconds of fuel. That's the whole story, and almost nobody has heard it. If this is the kind of history that should have been a film but wasn't, subscribe and drop your suggestions in the comments. I read them all. See you on the next one.